I cannot imagine that the day is here. I've been imagining this for the past 4 months to ask you, what do you think about Iceland? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. it's an Icelandic joke, but I'll start with a serious one. Both of you are not living in Silicon Valley, which is known as the startup hub for all the companies that we use daily. But we're starting to see a change in the trend. But I wanted to go a little back and ask Brad, you're from New York. How did the ecosystem develop there?
Okay. So the ecosystem in New York developed in fits and starts, which I think is typical of any entrepreneurial ecosystem. In the late 90s, there was a surge of investment activity and opportunity in New York. It wasn't particularly well grounded. A lot of the startups in New York in the late 90s were actually startups that weren't building product. They were providing services to the media industry in New York. So they did web shops, web services and things like that for the big media companies. There were a few exceptions. There were companies like DoubleClick that were started in New York at that time. But there wasn't, when the bubble burst in 2000, there wasn't much substance there. And so New York suffered pretty greatly after that. But there were this small group of entrepreneurs that emerged from the rubble, the people who had created DoubleClick and a few others. And after the collapse of 2000, those people continued to work on startups and continued to invest in startups and invest time and money in not just their own startups, but in other people's startups around New York. And during sort of the dark years of 2001, 2002, 2003, there was a lot of company formation in New York that, as the economy began to come back, began to create the foundation for the next wave. And the next wave really came into its own in sort of 2006, 2007, when this new group of entrepreneurs in New York began building real companies, companies that were creating product, creating services on the internet. And those companies were funded by the serial entrepreneurs that came out of the first wave, and supported by them and networked by them. And those companies began to have fairly quickly a global presence as a result of the fact that they were building services that were deployed on the internet. That in turn began to attract attention to New York, additional investment to New York, immigration into New York from people who were either tech savvy or committed to building tech companies. Out of that came what we now see, which is, I guess in the US, the second largest center for venture capital investment. I've seen some maps that show 500 some venture-backed startups in New York now. There's sort of a heat map that shows a lot of activity in the Flatiron area where we're based, and then also in Brooklyn. And I think it's a very much more robust and sustainable ecosystem that we now have there.
Okay, great. One element that I got out of the description you gave was, it was the entrepreneurs who created wealth, who continued to spend time, money, and effort to keep the ecosystem going. And you know that is one element of message that I got out. But Brad Feld, you are not, again, from Silicon Valley. You live in Boulder, Colorado, and Boulder has become a big, hot startup hub now. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey? How did it happen? I mean, you've been there all the time, actually.
Well, I haven't actually been there the whole time. I lived in Boston in the 1980s till the mid-1990s. I moved to Boulder in 1995. I didn't know anybody in Boulder. My wife's from Alaska, and she and I were living in Boston, and she told me she was moving to Boulder, and I was welcome to come with her if I wanted to. That's how I ended up in Boulder. I invested all around the U.S., so I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area. I spent a lot of time in Seattle, New York, and Boston, and I figured being in the middle of the United States was more convenient than living in Boston, plus I didn't like Boston all that much as a place to live. The Boulder startup community really around software and tech really dates back into the 1960s. And if you look at Boulder broadly as an entrepreneurial ecosystem, there are a handful of different communities that are all linked together. So the natural foods industry was really started in Boulder, Colorado. I don't know if you're familiar with a company called Celestial Seasonings, but it's a tea company that literally was one of the very first organic companies in the country. There are many examples of companies in that category. If you look at the outdoors industry as well, many companies in the U.S. sort of emerged from roots in Boulder. If you look at software, tech, internet, the roots there were really a combination of two different industries. One was the storage industry, which in the 1960s and 1970s really began with a heavy concentration in Colorado. There were companies called Storage Tech and Exabyte, Colorado Memory Systems, that were very significant players in tape and disk storage. Miniscribe would be another example of a company in that category. We also had the cable industry started with real growth in the Colorado region. There's a company ultimately called TCI, which AT&T bought, which is one of the largest cable companies. The commonality between these companies was that they had many software engineers. Even though they were hardware and network related technologies, the software engineering talent in and around Boulder was incredibly strong. It's a university town, so we have a lot of young people, a lot of computer scientists. We have several government labs, so very heavy concentration of PhDs. And on a per capita basis, I believe Boulder has the highest percentage per capita in the country, in the United States, of both PhDs and computer science. So you have this sort of concentration of very smart people in a town that fundamentally is a hippie town. So I like to describe Boulder as the place where the people going to California from the East Coast ran out of gas. And they looked around and like, this is kind of cool. And you know, it was easy for them to get marijuana and they could just sort of hang out and be happy. And so they stayed, and that was the 1960s and 1970s. By the 1980s, and by the time I moved there in the 1990s, there was a pretty vibrant but small, because it's a relatively small community. Boulder itself is 100,000 people, probably fits in one building in Manhattan, the entire city, which is kind of startling to think about. But 250,000 people for the Boulder metro, and it's linked about 30 miles away to Denver, which is a 2 million person city. The concentration of activity in Boulder in the mid-90s to 2000 followed a similar arc that Brad described in New York, with one exception, which is I think that there were actually many more substantive companies versus these sort of services layer companies because of the type of product and technology that came out of the software engineering, albeit a tighter concentration, smaller number, but tighter concentration both geographically and functionally. The bubble was tough on Boulder also, but it bounced back very quickly. Again, entrepreneur-led. So many entrepreneurs made some money in the 90s. They had failure in 2000, 2001. By 2002, 2003, these entrepreneurs were starting companies again, and they were funding each other's companies. And it wasn't really driven off of the venture capital investors or any outside forces. It was just the entrepreneurs deciding to go start the next wave of companies. And by about 2005, 2006, 2007, you had this sort of Cambrian explosion of new companies being created that had influence, around the country and around the world. At the same time, in 2006, we started a program in Boulder called TechStars, which was one of the first accelerators and was the first mentor-driven accelerator, with the idea of getting first-time and new entrepreneurs and the existing entrepreneurial ecosystem integrated together around the act of creating 10 or so companies a year. And all of these things were sort of at the beginning point of what has been a very rapid climb. Yep.
It's a fabulous story for Colorado. I'm curious, so when did you guys even first think about Iceland? Maybe Brad, we should start with you. Because, you know, I had no choice because I married an Icelander. But, you know, you have a choice, but you didn't.
Actually, the first time I thought about Iceland predates the volcano and the financial collapse. It was on a flight 10 years ago from New York to Stockholm, and not stopping in Iceland, but passing over the north coast of Iceland on a beautiful clear day, looking down and going, holy cow. Look at that. I mean, it was the most dramatic landscape I'd ever seen. And so my first impression of Iceland was wow. But I wasn't thinking at the time about Iceland as a hub for technology or innovation. I was just thinking about the geology of it at the moment. Since then, I have become very involved in the U.S. in sort of the evolution of a policy framework for supporting innovation. And I've become concerned that, as the President mentioned, that there is a natural tendency, a conservative tendency on behalf of the incumbents in any market to sort of defend their existing market position and business models against the emergence of innovation through a political process of urging regulation that will sort of help support their market position. And that's been discouraging in the U.S. And I've begun to think about how to address that problem. And obviously, it was pointed out to me that in the U.S. the incumbents have a very effective lobbying ability within our political system, but the future does not have a lobby. And I started thinking, okay, so can we organize the future? And that means organizing all of you people out there, and that's not easy because generally the future is working on creating stuff and innovating and not spending a lot of time thinking about the environment within which they're innovating. So, but we're doing that. We're doing that in the U.S. But I also started thinking about the degree to which there could be beacons in the world. There could be charter nodes or that interface with the internet in a way that is more conducive to innovation. And Iceland just pops up when you think that way. And it pops up for a number of the reasons that the President mentioned. It pops up because of the availability of green energy. It pops up because of the climate and the capacity to cool servers. It pops up because of the nature of the population, the entrepreneurial nature of the population, the education of the population, and not just the geographic positioning of Iceland, but also the geopolitical positioning of Iceland makes it a very interesting place to have that conversation. And my interest in Iceland is to be here to help start that conversation, because I think that conversation will then spill over globally, because we're not in an isolated world anymore. It's really kind of hard to have any conversation without it being shared on the internet, and hopefully that would be a productive.
It's being shared right now, as you can see.
There we go.
Brad?
My mother told me that the first word out of my mouth was Iceland. I first thought of Iceland because of a friend of mine who's in this room somewhere. Where's Isaac? Isaac Cotto, who many of you probably know, and I worked together many years ago. And I remember a conversation with him where he told me about a company that he was involved in here in Iceland that was a gaming company, which is now I know as CCP. And it was kind of curious that there was a company in Iceland, that was a technology kind of, just hadn't occurred to me. And I then heard about Iceland again when Isaac and a very good friend of mine, Neil Robertson, were involved in the beginnings of what turned into Vern Global. And I talked to Neil a number of times about it, and he was always going to Iceland, and I kind of kept thinking there was a girl here, but it was a data center instead. So, you know, I had some, I think, ambient awareness of what was going on. And more importantly is I have a very deeply held belief that you can create startup communities anywhere. And philosophically, like Brad, I'm a huge believer in the innovator against the incumbent. Philosophically, you know, Brad and I have both struggled with many of the same kind of challenges, and I think the work that we do is fundamentally trying to support people who are the innovators and the disruptors against the incumbents. And I love the construct of creating startup communities in places that are not obvious for exactly that same reason. I spend a lot of time in Alaska, where my wife is from, and one of the things that I find powerful about being in Alaska is that everybody in Alaska has a story, and they're there for a reason, and they have, you know, they have a thing they're trying to do, and sometimes those things are inspiring, and sometimes they're not, but they're all very personal. And I just in the couple of days that I've been here, I've had the same kind of experience in many of the conversations that I've had with people, and I find that very, very powerful. So, sort of this construct of Iceland as another place where over time you know, take the independent spirit of this country and do something dramatic with it that has, as Brad says, real impact on the future. I love the phrase organizing the future, you know, and sort of trying to do something with it. It's very powerful. In terms of coming here, I had never really thought about coming here other than, you know, maybe someday I'd go to Iceland and this guy Bala sent me an email saying, I want to do this conference, will you come speak at the conference? And I don't remember what my response was, but it was probably something like, when is it?
You said, nudge me.
Yeah, nudge me, bother me, which he's very good at. For those of you that don't know what a nudge is, nudge, right? He continued.
Sure most of them
my sort of general rule of thumb is I'm interested and curious, because part of what informs the way I think about the world is to get exposed to lots of different people that are doing the same kinds of things I'm interested in, but in lots of different places. And so that was really what drove me to come here.
Brilliant. So both of you see there's a fantastic opportunity in front of us, whether it's Iceland or anywhere in the world. But particularly for Iceland, if we take this long-term view, Brad, what would be the path that you would envision? Let's say you live in Iceland and you're thinking this path. What would be the kind of things you would be thinking of doing?
Well, I'm going to repeat something I said on the bus this morning to the people that were trying to take a nap while I talked at them. I spent a lot of time thinking about the arc that Boulder's been on, you know, for the last 40 or 50 years, the arc that, for example, Silicon Valley, which really is two startup communities, it's San Francisco and the peninsula, they're very different, but what that arc has been for a very long period of time. I spent a lot of time in Boston, I've been in and around New York, and when I step back and think about the commonality of what drives entrepreneurial community or startup community. I like to call them startup communities instead of entrepreneurial communities, because I think the word entrepreneur is starting to become overused. And it has not quite the right texture as a startup does. There are four commonalities, and they're very simple. The first is that the leadership of the startup community has to be entrepreneurs, period. So there are two categories of participants. There are leaders and there are feeders. And they're both very, very important. The leaders are the entrepreneurs. The feeders are everyone else. Government, university, venture capitalists, big business, anybody who wants to engage. And the interesting thing is there's a very powerful relationship between these two, but the reason that the entrepreneurs have to be leaders is that you have to take a 20-plus year view. And almost everything else runs in cycles that are too short. Right? Government runs in shorter cycles, university runs in shorter cycles. Entrepreneurs can run in 20-plus year cycles. And I like to say 20 years, but think about it as long into the future as you can think. Rest of your working life. So, number one, the leaders are entrepreneurs. Number two, you have to take a 20-year view. Number three, you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community. It has to be very, very easy to show up and be welcome. And I'll tell you, I've shown up, I've been here for 2 days, I think you've had the same experience. This is a very easy place to feel welcome. So you're doing an awesome job at that. Make sure you're doing that with each other. If somebody is not successful at something, that's fine. Failure is something that you should wear with a badge of honor and you should learn from, not something that should be shunned. Right? Be inclusive no matter where people are in their cycle, wherever they are in their career. They're first-time entrepreneur, they're very experienced, or they're grumpy at the end of their career. They're all to be included. And then last is make sure you have a steady flow of new people into the system. Not just young people, new people. Always make sure that you're doing things to engage folks. And I'd layer on top of that, you have a very, very powerful phenomena on the feeder side here. It was great the last 2 days to be exposed to your president, who I think is awesome. Just awesome. I mean, it's the second time I've heard you stand up and talk extemporaneously about innovation and entrepreneurship, and both be coherent and meaningful, which is, in my experience, unique for somebody from government. Fabulous. And, you know, I'd say the same thing about our ambassador. I mean, so clear thinking in terms of not just innovation and entrepreneurship, but how it relates to this country. I was at the university. I've spent some time talking to a few people at the University of Reykjavik. You've got great people who are thinking forward about this idea of innovation, and that's so incredibly powerful. And that's linked into the leadership, which is all of y'all. And I really encourage you to make a commitment to this place if you want to be a leader for a long period of time, because that's what makes a difference.
Brad?
So I really like the leaders and feeders model. Interestingly, there's a real parallel between the situation here in Iceland and the situation in New York. After the financial collapse in New York, I said in New York, actually, the financial collapse in New York. There was one there too. In 2008, the government of the city of New York came to us and a number of other technology investors and people in the technology community and said, we really believe that the financial market is never going to come back quite the way it was, and we need to replace that tax base. And we believe that the way we're going to replace that tax base is going to be with entrepreneurship and technology. And so they said, give us a roadmap, tell us what to do. And they were really frustrated with our answer because our answer was, don't do anything. And the reason for that is that it is very difficult, for many of the reasons that Brad mentioned, for a government to actually proactively create entrepreneurship. And you know, a lot of the efforts, very well intentioned, but actually kind of subvert the effort because they corrupt some of the incentives when there are, you know, tax incentives and you know, and government controlled funds and things like that are, you know, competing in the marketplace. But the thing that the city can do, and I think the government of Iceland can do, is really create a fabulous environment. And so we talk to them about infrastructure. We talk to them about making sure that the connectivity in New York is good and world class, and it turns out to be very tricky to do that because of the way in the US and particularly in New York, connectivity is provided through a public-private partnership where there's a franchise agreement where there are people who run the cables and the fiber optics under the streets that are privately owned, but they're franchised by the government, and there's a long-standing relationship there, and getting them to push into new markets and new geographies is difficult, but focus on that. Make sure that every place that an entrepreneur wants to build a business, they've got a fiber optic connection. And
this place is connected, fiber optic. I'm right.
Right here?
Yeah, I think so.
So we also talked about, so that's an infrastructure investment that's a really wonderful role for government to you know, whether it's done in a private-public partnership or whether it's done directly, get that infrastructure in place. And then, you know, work on the quality of life. And so things like parks and the arts and you know, create, you know, make it a wonderful place to be, and you'll naturally find entrepreneurs coming to you. There's something unique about this current wave of entrepreneurship, and that is that it's happening not at the infrastructure layer. We're not, there's a lot of innovation taking place in chips and bits and routers and that core infrastructure. But the current wave is actually happening at not so much the interface between the machine and the data, for instance, but rather between the data and the people. And so it's interesting. Brad mentioned that it's very different. The city of San Francisco and Silicon Valley are very different. Silicon Valley was a fabulous laboratory and hotbed of innovation around the infrastructure. But as the opportunity moved to the applications layer and to the relationship between the network and people, the entrepreneurs moved to the city. And if you look at our portfolio around the world, we have investments in Berlin, in London, in New York, in San Francisco. These are cultured urban centers that attract a kind of person who's actually interested in people. And I think that Reykjavik has that opportunity, and I think that the investment that's been made in the Opera House and in the other cultural amenities will actually work really well to help attract people.
Great. So maybe final question, because we're running on time. So there are lots of young entrepreneurs.
We got to all your questions, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I saw this. Bala had a list like of 400 questions we were going to be asked. So.
We don't have that much time.
That's fine.
But you answered most of it. There are lots of young entrepreneurs in this room today, and most of them are starting out new. Some of them have gone through the path before. So what's your quintessential advice for a young startup getting out of Iceland? What do you think that should inspire them? What do you think should happen for them to continue to pursue this tumultuous path? Because I'm sure you know what it is.
Yeah. So let me answer with two different comments. One will be specific, and then I want to give you a more general one that came out of a conversation I had with somebody last night that I wrote a blog post about this morning. The specific is, when I look at the companies that I've been an investor in and the entrepreneurs I've worked with over the last 25, 30 years, and I look at what has been the greatest successes. And when I say greatest successes, I don't necessarily only mean the greatest financial successes. So I'm going to define success more broadly than just financial. Those were people who were working on something they were obsessed with. They were totally, completely obsessed with the product they were creating. And I've come to believe, when I first started doing investing about a little bit less than 20 years ago, there was sort of lots of conversation about team and market size and product and opportunity and total available market and technology defensibility and all this stuff. And I've come to conclude, when I look back, that the people who were obsessed with their product from the beginning of the arc of their business were the ones who created the most success. And that's it. And everything else is kind of blurry noise. And there's lots of reasons for that, and I could spend a lot of time talking about that. But that would be the advice. If you are not obsessed with the product you are working on, step back and think about how you're spending time. And that leads to the second point. We were talking last night, I can't remember the name of the person I was talking to, I was sitting next to. We were talking about what it takes to create a fulfilling life. So, we'd had a lot of wine, and the conversation goes to where it goes. And I was thinking about that as I was waking up this morning and talking to Amy over coffee. And I said, my answer really is that you find people that you love in a place you want to be, working on a thing you care about. And if you can combine those three things, you'll have a fulfilling life. And put that against the first question. You're obsessed about the product as an entrepreneur, and it's very, very powerful. So if you love being here, surround yourself with people that you care about, and pick a thing you're obsessed about to spend your entrepreneurial energy on. That increases your chance of success greatly.
Yeah. Brad?
Ditto. And to add one small thing to that, the the wonderful thing about the opportunity that all of us have to work in a medium that is inherently global, that allows you to create a business and reach anyone in the world with that business from any place in the world, is, and the fact that historically, to date, it's been possible to do that without asking anyone permission. You don't have to ask permission to create a business on the internet. That has meant that many, many more people are actually pursuing things that they're passionate about. Whether they're, carving handmade wooden toys and selling them on Etsy, or creating new services on the internet, they're doing the thing that they're passionate about. So if you find yourself doing something that you're not passionate about, I'd really encourage you to step back and say, gosh, why am I doing that? Is there some way that I can pursue something that I do really care about, that I do find meaning in? And if you can't, then I suggest we have a really big problem, and that we should all spend time figuring out why that's the case, and move towards a world where we all can do that.
Thank you. I say that it's been a dream to get you guys here, and I feel very strongly about building relationships and connecting people, and I think you guys have done a fantastic job for the last couple of days. I couldn't have asked for more, so I just want to say thank you. It's been great. Yeah, thank you.